Here we go. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Keyser. This is the Son of Man Urantia Project. Today's episode is Chapter 63, Before the Sanhedrin Court. In secret, Annas' agents had told the captain of the Roman soldiers to bring Jesus immediately to his palace after he had been arrested. The former high priest wanted to hold on to his prestige as the chief religious authority of the Jews. He also had another reason for keeping Jesus at his house for several hours, and that was to allow time to legally call together the Sanhedrin. It was not lawful to convene the Sanhedrin court before the morning sacrifice in the temple, and that animal was killed about 3 o'clock in the morning. Annas knew that some 30 members of the Sanhedrin, all openly and strongly opposed to Jesus, had been waiting since midnight at his son-in-law Caiaphas' palace. This group also constituted a court, because it only took 23 members to do so, and they were ready to judge Jesus as soon as he was put in front of them. Jesus spent about 3 hours at Annas' palace on Mount Olivet, not far from the Gethsemane garden, where they had arrested him. John Zebedee was safe and free in Annas' palace, not only because of the Roman captain's word, but also because he and his brother James were well known to the older servants, having been guests at the palace many times because the former high priest was a distant relative of their mother. Annas' examination. Annas, enriched by the temple revenues, his son-in-law, the acting high priest, and with his relationships with the Roman authorities, was indeed the most powerful person in all of Jewry. He was suave, tactful, and plotting. He wanted to be in charge of getting rid of Jesus. He feared to trust such an important task completely to his brusque and aggressive son-in-law. Annas wanted to make sure that the Sadducees were in charge of Jesus' trial. He was afraid that some of the Pharisees might be sympathetic, seeing that practically all of the members of the Sanhedrin who had fallen over to Jesus had been Pharisees. Annas had not seen Jesus for several years, not since the time when he had shown up at his house and then immediately left when he saw Annas' reserve and greeting him. Annas had thought about using this early acquaintance to try and get Jesus to leave Palestine and to abandon his claims. He was reluctant to take part in murdering a good man, and he had thought that Jesus might decide to leave the country instead of being killed. But when Annas stood in front of the stalwart and determined Galilean, he knew at once that it would be useless to make such proposals. Jesus was even more majestic and well-poised than Annas remembered him. When Jesus was young, Annas had taken a great interest in him, but now his income was threatened by Jesus driving the money changers and other merchants out of the temple. This act had made the former high priest far angrier than Jesus' teachings had. Annas entered his spacious audience chamber, sat down in a large chair, and ordered Jesus to be brought before him. After a few moments silently looking at the master, he said, "You realize that something has to be done about your teaching, because you are disturbing the peace and order of our country." As Annas looked questioningly at Jesus, the master looked straight into his eyes, but said nothing. Again, Annas spoke. "What are the names of your disciples, besides Simon Zelotes, the agitator?" Again, Jesus looked down on him, but he did not answer. Annas was upset by Jesus' refusal to answer his questions, so much so that he said, "Do you not care if I am friendly to you or not? Do you have no regard for the power I have in deciding your fate?" When Jesus heard this, he said, "Annas, you know that you could have no power over me unless it was permitted by my Father. Some would destroy the Son of Man because they are ignorant. They do not know any better. But you, friend, know what you are doing. How can you then reject the light of God?" Jesus' kind manner almost bewildered Annas. But he had already made up his mind that Jesus either had to die or he had to leave Palestine. So he summoned up his courage and asked, "Just what is it you are trying to teach the people? What do you claim to be?" And Jesus answered, "You know full well that I have spoken plainly to the world. I have taught in the synagogues and many times in the temple, where all the Jews and many of the Gentiles have heard me. In secret, I have spoken nothing. Why then do you ask me about my teaching? Why do you not summon those who have heard me and ask them? Behold, all Jerusalem has heard what I have spoken, even if you yourself have not heard these teachings." But before Annas could reply, the chief steward of the palace, who was standing near, slapped Jesus in the face, saying, "How dare you answer the high priest with such words?" Annas did not reprimand the steward, but Jesus said to him, "My friend, if I have spoken evil, bear witness against the evil. But if I have spoken the truth, why then would you hit me?" Although Annas regretted that his steward had hit Jesus, he was too proud to show any notice of it. Confused, he went into another room, leaving Jesus alone with the household servants and the temple guards for almost an hour. When he returned, going up to Jesus' side, he said, "Do you claim to be the Messiah, the deliverer of Israel?" And Jesus said, "Annas, you have known me since I was a boy. You know that I claim to be nothing except what my Father has made me, and that I have been sent to all men, Jew as well as Gentile." Then Annas said, "I have been told that you have claimed to be the Messiah. Is that true?" Jesus looked at Annas, but only said, "So you have said." About this time, messengers arrived from Caiaphas' palace to ask what time Jesus would be brought before the Sanhedrin court. And since it was nearing daybreak, Annas thought it best to send Jesus, bound and in the custody of the temple guards, to Caiaphas. A short time later, he followed after them. Peter in the courtyard. As the band that was guarding Jesus approached the entrance to Annas' palace, John Zebedee was marching alongside the Roman captain. Judas had dropped some distance behind everyone, and Simon Peter still followed from a ways off. After John had entered the palace courtyard with Jesus and the guards, Judas came up to the gate. But when he saw John and Jesus, he decided to go over to Caiaphas' home, where he knew that Jesus' real trial would take place later. Soon after Judas left, Simon Peter arrived, and as he stood before the gate, John looked over and saw him just about the time that they were taking Jesus into the palace. The woman servant who was in charge of the gate knew John, and when he asked her to let Peter in, she was happy to do so. Peter, after entering the courtyard, went over to the charcoal fire to warm up, because the night was chilly. He felt very much out of place here among Jesus' enemies, and indeed, he was out of place. Jesus had not told him to stay near at hand like he had told John. Peter was supposed to be with the other apostles, who had been specifically warned not to risk their lives during Jesus' trial and crucifixion. Peter had thrown his sword away shortly before he got to the palace gate, So he entered Annas' courtyard unarmed. His mind was whirling. He was confused. He could scarcely realize that Jesus had been arrested. Peter could not grasp the reality of the situation, that he was there in Annas' courtyard, warming up beside the high priest's servants. He wondered what the other apostles were doing, and wondering how John had been admitted to the palace, he decided that it was because the servants knew John, since he had asked the gatekeeper to let him in. Shortly after the woman managing the gate let Peter in, and while he was warming up by the fire, she went over to him and mischievously said, "Are you not also one of this man's disciples?" Now, Peter should not have been surprised at being recognized, because it was John who had asked that girl to let him pass through the palace gates. But he was so nervous that being recognized as an apostle threw him off balance, and with only one thought uppermost in his mind, the thought of escaping with his life, he quickly answered the maid and said, "I am not." Then, soon after, another servant came up to Peter and asked, "Did I not see you in the garden when they arrested this fellow? Are you not also one of his followers?" Peter was now thoroughly alarmed. He saw no way of safely escaping from these accusers, so he hotly denied all association with Jesus, saying, "I do not know this man, neither am I one of his followers." About this time, the woman at the gate got Peter to one side and said, "I am sure you are a disciple of this Jesus, not only because one of his followers asked me to let you into the courtyard, but because my sister here has seen you in the temple with this man. Why do you deny this?" When Peter heard the maid accuse him, with a lot of cussing and swearing, he denied all knowledge of Jesus, again saying, "I am not this man's follower. I do not even know him. I have never heard of him before." Peter left the fire pit for a while and walked around the courtyard. He wanted to escape, but he was afraid to attract attention to himself. Getting cold, he returned to the fire, and one of the men standing near him said, "Surely you are one of this man's disciples. This Jesus is a Galilean, and your speech betrays you, because you also speak as a Galilean." And again, Peter denied all connection with his master. Peter was so nervous that he tried to escape talking with his accusers by leaving the fire and going off by himself onto the porch. After he had isolated himself for more than an hour, the gatekeeper and her sister happened on him again, and both of them again teased him and said he was one of Jesus' followers. And again, Peter denied that he was. And just then, as he had once more denied all association with Jesus, the cock crowed, and Peter remembered the Master's words, warning him earlier that same night of this very thing. As he stood there, his heart heavy and now crushed with guilt, the palace doors opened, and the guards led Jesus past him on the way to Caiaphas' house. As the Master passed Peter, Jesus saw by the torchlight the despair on his former self-confident and superficially brave apostle's face, and he turned and looked at Peter. Peter never forgot that look as long as he lived. No mortal had ever seen such pity and love in the Master's face. After Jesus and the guards passed out of the palace gates, Peter followed them, but only for a short distance. He could not go any further. He sat down by the side of the road and cried. He was bitter, and when he was done crying those agonizing tears, he started back to the camp, hoping to find Andrew, his brother. When he got there, he only found David Zebedee, who sent a messenger along with him to guide him to where his brother was hiding in Jerusalem. Peter's entire experience occurred in Annas' palace courtyard on Mount Olivet. He did not follow Jesus and the high priest to Caiaphas' palace. Since Peter realized that he had repeatedly denied Jesus by the cock crowing, that indicates that all of this happened outside of Jerusalem, because it was against the law to keep chickens in the city proper. Up until the cock crowed and Peter came to his better senses, his only thought, walking up and down the porch to keep warm, was how clever he had been dodging the servants' accusations, identifying him with Jesus. At the time, he was only thinking that these servants had no moral or legal right to question him, and he congratulated himself thinking that he had avoided being identified and possibly subjected to arrest. Not until the cock crowed did it dawn on Peter that he had denied his master, and not until Jesus had looked at him did he realize that he had failed to live up to his privileges as an ambassador of the kingdom. Having taken the first step along the path of compromise and least resistance, there was no other choice apparent to Peter except continuing his decided course. It requires a great and noble character, having started out wrong, to turn around and go right. All too often, a person's mind tends to justify continuing on the wrong path once started. Peter never fully believed that he could be forgiven until he met Jesus after the resurrection, and he saw that his master received him just like he did before this tragic night of denials. Before the Sanhedrin court, it was about 3:30 Friday morning when the chief priest, Caiaphas, called the Sanhedrin court to order and asked for Jesus to be brought before them for his formal trial. 3 times before, by a large majority vote, the Sanhedrin had ordered Jesus' death on informal charges of blasphemy, law-breaking, and flouting the traditions of Israel. This was not a regular meeting of the Sanhedrin, and it was not held in the usual temple chamber hewn out of stone. This was a special court of some 30 members of the Sanhedrin, and it was being held in the high priest's palace. John Zebedee was with Jesus throughout this so-called trial. How these scribes, Sadducees, chief priests, and some of the Pharisees flattered themselves that Jesus, the one who had disturbed their position and challenged their authority, was now firmly in their hands, and they were resolved that he would never escape alive. Ordinarily, the Jews, when trying a man about something that could result in the death sentence, proceeded carefully, and they had safeguards in place to ensure fairness when selecting the witnesses and conducting the trial. But this time, Caiaphas acted more like a prosecutor than an unbiased judge. Jesus appeared before this court dressed in his usual clothes and with his hands tied behind his back. The entire court was startled and somewhat confused by how majestic he looked. Never had they gazed on a prisoner or witnessed such composure in a man on trial for his life. The Jewish law required that at least 2 witnesses had to agree on any point before a charge could be made against the prisoner. Judas could not be used as a witness because the Jews specifically forbid a traitor's testimony. More than 20 false witnesses were there to testify against Jesus, but their testimony was so contradictory, and it was so evident that it was all trumped up, that even the Sanhedrin was ashamed of it. Jesus stood there, looking down gently on the liars, and his manner made the witnesses uneasy. The entire time, the master never said a word. He made no reply to their many lies. The first time that any two of the witnesses ever even came close to an agreement was when two men testified that in one of Jesus' talks they had heard him say that he would destroy this temple made with hands and in 3 days make another temple without hands. Now, that was not exactly what Jesus had said, and regardless, he had pointed to his own body when he made that remark. Although the high priest shouted at Jesus, "Are you not going to answer any of these charges?" Jesus did not say a word. He stood there in silence while everyone came up and told their lies. And they were filled with such hatred, fanaticism, and dishonest exaggeration that their testimony was meaningless. The very best answer to their lies was Jesus' calm and majestic silence. Shortly after the trial started, Annas arrived and took his seat beside Caiaphas. Annas now got up and argued that Jesus, threatening to destroy the temple, was enough to bring 3 charges against him. 1, that he was a liar and dangerous for the people. He taught them impossible things and otherwise deceived them. 2, that he was a fanatic and a revolutionary. He advocated violently destroying the sacred temple. 3, that he taught magic because he promised to build a new temple and to do so without hands. The full Sanhedrin had already agreed that Jesus was guilty of breaking Jewish laws that carried the death sentence. But now they needed to come up with charges that would allow Pilate to also order the death sentence. They knew that they had to have the Roman governor's consent before it was legal to kill Jesus. And Annas intended to follow the idea of making it appear that Jesus was too dangerous of a teacher to be out among the people. But Caiaphas could not stand seeing Jesus standing there in unbroken silence and perfect composure. He thought he knew of at least one way that he could be made to speak. So he rushed over to Jesus' side and, shaking an accusing finger in Jesus' face, said, "I command you, in the name of the living God, that you tell us whether you are the deliverer, the Son of God." And Jesus said to Caiaphas, "I am. Soon I go to the Father, and presently will the Son of Man be clothed with power and once more reign over the hosts of heaven." When the high priest heard Jesus say this, he got angry and, clutching and tearing his outer court robe, yelled, "Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, you have all heard this man speaking against God. Now, what do you think should be done with this blasphemer and lawbreaker?" And they all answered as one, saying, "He is worthy of death. Crucify him." Jesus showed no interest in any of these questions he was asked, except for the one question relating to his mission on earth. When asked if he were the Son of God, he instantly and undeniably said yes. Annas wanted the trial to continue and to make the charges against Jesus stronger before presenting them to Pilate. But the others were anxious to get the trial over with. No secular work could be done after noon that day, and they all wanted to start preparing for the Passover. And because they were afraid that Pilate might leave at any time and return to the Roman capital, since he was only in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Annas lost that argument and could not keep control of the court. After Jesus had answered Caiaphas in such an unexpected way, the high priest stepped forward and hit him in the face with his hand. Annas sat there in shock as he watched the other members of the court spit in Jesus' face and mockingly slap him as they left. And in disorder and confusion, this first session of Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin ended at 4:30 in the morning. Prejudiced and blinded by tradition, 30 false judges with their false witnesses were presuming to judge the righteous creator of a universe. And these accusers, passionate with hate, were infuriated at this God-man's majesty and superb bearing. His silence was terrible to endure. His words were defiant and fearless. Jesus was unmoved by their threats and unafraid of their assaults. Man sat in judgment on God, but even then, God loved them and would have saved them if he could. The hour of humiliation. The Jewish law required that whenever passing a death sentence, there had to be 2 sessions of the court. This second session was supposed to be held the day following the first, and the time in between the two was supposed to be spent fasting and mourning. But these men could not wait until the next day to confirm their decision that Jesus must die. They only waited 1 hour. In the meantime, Jesus was left in the courtroom with the temple guards, who, along with the high priest's servants, amused themselves by heaping every sort of dignity they could on the Son of Man. They mocked him, spit on him, and beat him cruelly. They would hit Jesus in the face with a stick and then say, "Prophesy to us, you the deliverer, who it was that hit you." And these insults and assaults on this unresisting Galilean went on for a full hour. During the mock trials and this hour of the guards and servants tormenting Jesus, John Zebedee, alone and pretty much terrified, waited in a room off to the side of the court. When the beatings had started, Jesus indicated to John with a nod of his head that he should leave the room. Jesus well knew that if he allowed his apostle to stay in the room to watch the insults, that John would be so resentful that he would probably do something that would get him killed. Throughout this awful hour, Jesus said nothing, for this gentle and sensitive soul, a human joined with the God of all, no part of his humiliation was worse than this hour at the mercy of cruel and ignorant guards and servants who had been aroused to abuse him by the Sanhedrin's example. The human heart can in no way imagine the shudder of indignation, the outrage that swept over a vast universe as the celestial beings witnessed their beloved sovereign submitting himself to his stupid and misguided creatures on the sin-darkened world of unfortunate Urantia. What is this animalistic trait in humanity that leads people to want to insult and physically assault whatever they cannot spiritually attain or intellectually achieve? In the semi-civilized person, there still lurks an evil brutality that looks to vent itself on those people who have superior wisdom and spirituality. Witness the brutal ferocity, the evil coarseness of these supposedly civilized people as they took a certain form of animal pleasure from physically attacking the unresisting Son of Man. As these blows, taunts, and insults fell on Jesus, he did not defend himself, but he was also not defenseless. Jesus was not beaten. He just was not fighting back in the physical sense of the meaning. These are the moments of the Master's greatest victories in his long and eventful career as maker, savior, and upholder of a vast and far-flung universe. Having lived a full life revealing God to humanity, Jesus was now making a new, unprecedented revelation of humanity to God. Jesus was now revealing to the worlds the final triumph over all fears in the isolated creature's personality. the Son of Man had finally realized his identity as the Son of God, Jesus did not hesitate to say that he and the Father were one. And on the truth of that supreme experience, he warned every kingdom believer to become one with him, even as he and his Father are one. In that way, the living experience of Jesus' religion becomes the technique, the way that allows spiritually isolated mortals on earth to escape the isolation of their personality, with all of its fear and helplessness. In the brotherhood of the kingdom of heaven, the faithful sons of God are finally delivered from both personal and planetary seclusion. The God-knowing believer increasingly experiences the universe's ecstasy of spiritual socialization, citizenship in heaven, and realizing one's divine destiny to become perfect with God. The second meeting of the court. At 5:30 in the morning, the court reassembled. Jesus was taken into the room to the side of the court where John was waiting. Here, the Roman soldier and the temple guards watched over Jesus while the court began formulating the charges they were going to present to Pilate. Annas made it clear to the others that charging Jesus with blasphemy, speaking against God, would carry no weight with Pilate. Judas was in the room during the second meeting of the court, but he did not testify. This session of the court only lasted half an hour, and when they ended the meeting to go before Pilate, they had drawn up the charges against Jesus, all worthy of the death penalty, under 3 headings. 1, that he was perverting the Jewish nation. He was deceiving the people and leading them to rebellion. 2, that he was teaching the people to refuse to pay Caesar's tax. 3, that he was claiming to be a king and the founder of a new sort of kingdom, and he was inciting treason against the emperor. This entire process was not normal and completely against Jewish law. No 2 witnesses had agreed on anything except those who testified about Jesus destroying the temple and raising it up again in 3 days. And even then, no witnesses were brought before for his defense, and Jesus was not allowed to explain what he had meant. The only point that the court could have consistently judged him on was blasphemy, and that would have rested entirely on his own testimony. But even with blasphemy, they did not cast a formal ballot for the death sentence. And now they dared to come up with 3 charges, all without witnesses, and all agreed on while Jesus was absent to take to Pilate. At this point, 3 of the Pharisees said no and left. Yes, they wanted to see Jesus destroyed, but they would not charge him without witnesses and in his absence. Jesus did not appear again before the Sanhedrin court. They did not want to look on his face as they judged his innocent life. Jesus did not know, at least as a man of the realm, of their formal charges until he later heard Pilate recite them. While Jesus was in the room with John and the guards, and while the court was in its second session, some of the women who hung around the high priest's palace, along with their friends, came to look at the strange prisoner, and one of them asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" And Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I ask you, you will not answer." At 6 o'clock that morning, Jesus was taken from Caiaphas' home to appear before Pilate and to be condemned to death for what the Sanhedrin had so unjustly ordered. Okay, that's it for chapter 63, before the Sanhedrin court. Coming up next is chapter 64, the trial before Pilate. The Defend liberty. Protect those kids. Get out there and find some way to serve man for nothing more or less than the sake of God. Godspeed, everybody. Bobby Keyser, out here.